close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Imagine you can feel the hollow ache in your stomach, not the casual kind of hunger you feel when lunch runs late, but the deep, gnawing kind that makes you lightheaded. The kind that reminds you, with every single breath, that you are one bad decision away from having absolutely nothing. Now imagine, in that exact moment, you look across the street and you see someone else who is worse off than you. What do? Most people would walk past. Most people would tell themselves, I'll help someone else another day, when I'm in a better position. When I have more to give. And no one could blame them for that. That's not cruelty. That's survival. But Amara didn't walk past. She was 23 years old, standing in the rain on a cracked sidewalk in the part of the city that the newspapers never write about, the part where the streetlights flicker and go out before 10 o'clock, where the smell of wet concrete mixes with the smoke from roadside grills, where people live quietly with heavy things they never speak out loud. She had one small, foil-wrapped meal in her hand. One. She had been holding it like something precious, because to her, it was. She had worked a double shift the day before, 13 hours on her feet, just to earn enough for one decent meal to carry her through to the following week. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even warm anymore. But it was hers, and she needed it. And then she saw him. He was sitting on the bottom step of an abandoned building, his back straight, unnervingly straight for someone in his position, like his body refused to fully surrender even when everything around him had. He wasn't holding a sign. He wasn't asking anyone for anything. He wasn't even looking up. He was just sitting there. Still. Quiet. Like a person trying very hard not to take up too much of the world's space. And something about that particular kind of quiet dignity cracked something open inside her chest. She walked over. She held out the meal. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, he didn't take it. Stay with this story, because what happens between these two people tonight, and then years from now, is something I think you need to hear. Because the ending? The ending is not what you think. Let me tell you who Amara really was. Because it would be easy and lazy to tell you she was simply a kind girl who gave her food away and then lived happily ever after. That's not a story. That's a greeting card. And Amara deserved more than a greeting card. Amara Osei had grown up learning, over and over again, that openness was a liability. She grew up in a house where love was conditional, where affection came attached to expectations, where the question was never how are you, but always what have you done. She had a mother who loved her, she believed that, but her mother's love was the exhausted kind, stretched thin over too many children and too many unpaid bills. Her mother didn't have time for tenderness. She had time for survival. And so Amara learned to be useful. She learned to give it to her siblings, to her community, to strangers, because giving was the one language she knew how to speak fluently. She gave and she helped and she showed up, and slowly, without fully realizing it, she built an entire identity around her own generosity. And then life did what life does. It let people in who didn't deserve to be there. There was a friend, a woman she had known since secondary school, someone she had loaned money to twice, someone she had defended in arguments she had no business getting involved in. That woman had smiled and borrowed until Amara had nothing left to borrow from, and then she had disappeared so cleanly it was as if she had never existed at all. There was a man, too. But that is a longer story for a different time. The point is this: by the time Amara was 23, standing on that rain-soaked street with her last foil-wrapped meal in her hand, she had already decided, quietly, firmly, the way you decide things when you're so tired that the decision doesn't even feel like a decision anymore. She had decided that giving only leaves you empty. And yet, she still walked across the street. She still held out the meal. Not because she had forgotten her rule. Not because she was naive. But because some part of her, some stubborn, unkillable part, had never fully agreed with the rule in the first place. There was a voice somewhere in the center of her chest that had refused to go silent no matter how many times she had tried to silence it. He looked up at her. Up close, she could see he was young, maybe 18, maybe 20. Hard to tell. His face had a kind of sharpness to it that came from spending too long in places where softness was dangerous. His eyes were dark and very still, the way water goes still right before a storm. She thrust the food toward him again. He said, "I didn't ask." She said, "I know." Something shifted in the air between them. He looked at her differently, studied her, the way you study something you don't quite have a category for. Then he said, "Why would you help someone you don't know?" And this is the part that I need you to hear very carefully. Because what she said next became the spine of everything that followed. Everything that would happen between these two people, all of it, hung on these 7 words. She said, "Because I know what it feels like to be unseen." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he took the food. He didn't say thank you. Not with words. But he looked at her, really looked at her, the way very few people had ever bothered to. Like he was committing her face to a place deep enough that the years couldn't reach it. Now, I have to be honest with you. Amara almost didn't give him that meal. I want you to understand that. Because it's important. She had walked over. She had extended her hand. And then, in the space of one long breath, she had almost pulled it back. Her stomach had growled. Not gently. Loudly. Humiliatingly. She had stood there with the food in her hand and heard her own body begging her to choose herself, and for one full, aching moment, she had considered it. She had thought, "This is foolish. You can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself first." She had even taken a half step backward. Then she turned back. And I think about that half step a lot. That one small reversal of direction. That single moment where she could have walked away and no one, not God, not the universe, not the boy sitting on the steps, would have blamed her. But she didn't. She turned back. She stepped forward. She gave. And as she was leaving, as the rain picked up and she pulled her jacket tighter around her own hunger, he called after her. He said, "If I ever become something, I'll come back for you." She didn't stop walking. But she smiled, not a warm smile, not a hopeful one. The kind of smile that lives behind the eyes. The kind that carries grief dressed up as amusement. She said, almost to herself, "People don't come back." But before we find out whether she was right or wrong about that, I have to tell you what the years did to both of them. And you need to hear this part. Because what happens next is where the real story begins. Don't go anywhere. Time is not neutral. I think we like to imagine that time simply passes, that it flows by us gently, like water, and we remain essentially ourselves on the other side of it. But that is not how it works. Time works on us. It presses. It reshapes. And if you are not careful, if you don't actively fight it, time will make you into someone you would not have recognized at 23. That is what happened to Amara. Not overnight. Not in any single dramatic moment. It happened the way erosion happens, slowly, imperceptibly, grain by grain, until one day you look at the cliff and realize it has a completely different shape than it used to. The years brought more people who took and disappeared. More positions where she stretched herself thin for others and was left holding the empty end. She tried, a few times, to recapture the version of herself who had walked across a rain-soaked street without thinking twice. She volunteered. She mentored a younger girl in her building. She sent money back home when she had it. But each of those efforts seemed to exact a higher and higher price. And one by one, as if extinguishing candles, she stopped. She stopped volunteering because the organization went under and the coordinator, the one who'd made her feel like the work mattered, moved away without a word of goodbye. She stopped mentoring the girl downstairs because the girl's mother grew suspicious and the whole thing became complicated in a way that made her want to retreat behind her own door and lock it. She stopped sending money home because her mother, in one of their rare phone calls, used the money to criticize the amount rather than appreciate the gesture. Kindness, she told herself, hadn't failed her. She needed to be clear about that. She refused to become someone who blamed kindness for her wounds. But people had failed her. Again. And again. And again. And so she built a wall. A careful, intelligent, beautifully constructed wall. Not the angry kind of wall, not the kind that snarls and pushes people away. Amara's wall was quieter than that. It looked like professionalism. It looked like being busy. It looked like a woman who had herself together so completely that she didn't seem to need anything from anyone. And into that wall, like a nail that had been hammered in gradually over 18 months, came a man named Kofi. Kofi Mensah was a good man in the way that a properly functioning appliance is good, reliable, consistent, never surprising, never troubling. He had a steady job. He had an apartment with actual furniture. He remembered her birthday and showed up with flowers that were not quite her type but were undeniably flowers. He was calm when she was tense, present when she expected absence, kind in a way that was, she had to admit it, completely without agenda. She did not love him. She knew this. She had known it from the third month, maybe the second. It sat in the back of her heart like a stone she kept trying to ignore, telling herself that love was not a lightning bolt but a slow warmth, and that perhaps this steadiness, this reliability, this absence of chaos, perhaps this was what mature love felt like. She said yes when he asked her to marry him. She said yes standing on his balcony with the city spread out below them and the ring catching the light and him looking at her with eyes that were so full of genuine hope that it physically hurt her to look directly at them. She said yes because she was 31 years old and because she was tired of waiting for something she had long since stopped believing in. And across the city, on a completely different trajectory, in a world she had no way of seeing, the boy from the steps was running. His name was Daniel Asante. And that is almost all I will tell you about him for now, because the rest of his story is something he will eventually have to tell for himself. What I will tell you is this: he had not stayed on those steps. The dignity she had noticed in him, the spine that refused to bend, that was not a performance. He had found his way, painfully and incrementally, into opportunities he had to fight for with every resource he had, including his pride. He had been mentored by a man who ran a small but serious business and who saw in Daniel the same kind of stillness that Amara had seen, not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of a person conserving energy for something worth spending it on. He built something. Slowly at first, then faster, the way fires work. He learned what he had always suspected, that he was good at seeing things other people didn't see. Patterns in markets. Gaps in industries. The place where what people needed and what the world was offering didn't quite match up. He was not flashy about it. He didn't build an empire and he didn't want one. But by 30 he was comfortable, and by 32 he was more than comfortable, and by 33 he had the kind of freedom that most people only gesture at when they say the word. And success, as it turns out, is a strange house to live in. Because you can fill it with every beautiful thing and still feel the echo of rooms that should not be empty. He had colleagues who respected him and associates who wanted things from him and a handful of friends he trusted with parts of himself, but not all of himself. He dated women who were interesting and accomplished and right in every way he could measure, and he ended every relationship with the same quiet, confused sense of something missing that he could never quite name. He had, over the years, tried to name it. And every time, every single time, the closest he could get was an image. A woman standing in the rain. Her jacket soaked through. Her stomach growling loud enough for him to hear. And her hand extended anyway. Because I know what it feels like to be unseen. He had never forgotten her face. He had told himself, for years, that this was just the power of memory, that the brain latches onto formative moments and romanticizes them. That she was probably just a woman living an ordinary life who had never thought about that evening again. But he hired someone to help him look anyway. And what they found stopped him cold. She was in the city. She was engaged. She was engaged to a man named Kofi Mensah. The wedding was 8 months away, and the girl who had once given away her last meal was now a woman who, from everything he could learn from the outside, had carefully sealed herself off from the version of herself that had done that. He stood in his office with this information and he was still for a very long time. And then he made a decision that probably looked, from the outside, like the worst idea he had ever had. He went to find her. Now, before I tell you what happened when they met again, I need to ask you something. And I want you to sit with this honestly. Have you ever stopped being who you are, just because life got hard enough that being who you were felt like too expensive a habit to keep? Have you ever looked at the person you were 5 years ago, the one who still believed in certain things, who still did certain things without asking whether it was worth it, and felt like that person was both you and a stranger at the same time? Because Amara had. And she hadn't quite found a way to grieve that. Stay with me. Because what happens next, the moment these two lives collide again, is not the reunion you're imagining. Not even close. She was sitting in a cafe near her office when he walked in. She didn't know he had been looking for her. She didn't know he had spent 3 weeks trying to engineer a casual-seeming encounter that didn't feel calculated. She didn't know any of that. She was just a woman having coffee before a meeting, her phone in her hand, half reading a message from Kofi about wedding venue logistics. He sat down across from her. She looked up. Studied him. A well-dressed man. Calm in a way that wasn't arrogance, the calm of someone who had made peace with himself somewhere along the way. She was polite. Neutral. Slightly guarded in the way that had become her default register. He said, "I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Daniel. We've met before." She looked at him again. More carefully. Nothing. He waited, and she could see him waiting, not impatiently, not nervously, but with the same quality of stillness she couldn't quite place. She said, "I don't think so. I'd remember." He said, "It was raining. You were carrying food." And the ground shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it shifts in films, with swelling music and tears rushing to the surface. It was quieter than that. A slow, cold recognition traveling from her memory down through her chest and into her hands, so that the coffee cup she was holding became very difficult to hold steadily. She looked at him. She said, "That was a long time ago." And those 4 words, the flatness of them, the deliberate distance packed inside them, told him everything he needed to know about how much had changed. He had imagined this moment many times. He had imagined relief. Gratitude. Perhaps even tears. He had imagined saying "it's me" and watching her face open up the way a room opens when you turn the lights on. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined meeting someone who looked like her and sounded like her and wore her face, and yet had so carefully, methodically locked every door he thought he was coming back to. He didn't push. He gave her his card. He told her simply that he had thought about that evening many times and that he would like to speak with her properly, whenever she was ready, if she was ever ready. She took the card because it would have been strange not to. She didn't call. For 2 weeks, she put the card in different places on her desk, in a drawer, in her bag, as if the location somehow affected what it meant. She thought about Kofi, who was good and steady and completely without complication. She thought about the wedding, which was 8 months away and which she was supposed to be excited about. She thought about a boy with a straight spine sitting on a broken step in the rain. She called. They met again, this time intentionally. A quiet restaurant, a corner table, the kind of place where the ambient noise is soft enough that real conversations are possible. He told her some of what had happened to him, not everything, but enough. The years on the street after that night, the man who had taken a chance on him, the slow climb that stopped feeling slow only in retrospect. He told her about success the way people who have actually earned it tend to speak about it, without performance, without embellishment, with a quiet kind of wonder at the accident of it. She listened. She was good at listening. She had always been good at listening. It was one of the things she had never managed to close off. And then she told him she was engaged. He said, "I know." The silence that followed that admission was thick with everything it implied, that he had looked for her, that he had known before he came, that this was not a coincidence. She should have been angry. She was aware, academically, that she should have been angry. But what she actually felt was more complicated than anger. She felt something that she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a full minute to identify it. She felt seen. Not by what he said. Not by any specific word or gesture. But by the fact that he had looked. By the fact that in a world where people moved on and moved on and moved on without ever glancing back, this particular person had looked backward for a decade to find a woman who had handed him a meal in the rain. She drove home in silence. She sat in her car in the parking lot of her building and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and she breathed, slowly, carefully, like someone managing a wound. Then she went upstairs and kissed Kofi on the cheek and asked him what he wanted for dinner. But Daniel did not disappear again. He didn't pursue her recklessly, no declarations, no grand gestures, no pressure. He was smarter than that. He was also more honest than that. What he did was simply remain present in the way that certain people are present, steadily, quietly, like a light left on in a window that you notice without ever quite deciding to look for it. They met for coffee twice more over the following month. She told herself it was closure. Curiosity. The perfectly reasonable human desire to understand a strange thread in the fabric of one's own history. But during the third meeting, he said something that unraveled her. He said, "Do you love him?" She opened her mouth to say yes. It was ready. The word was right there, assembled and waiting, completely prepared to be spoken. She closed her mouth. He didn't press. He didn't lean forward. He just looked at her with those still, dark eyes that had not changed, not in 15 years, not in the distance between that broken step and this restaurant table, and he waited. She said, "You came back too late." He said, "I came back when I could find you." And she stood up, and she gathered her things, and she walked out. She told herself, on the drive home, that this was exactly the problem with romanticizing the past. That she had been seduced by a story, her own story, no less, and that stories were not the same as lives. That a man who had found her because of one act of kindness a decade ago was not necessarily a man who knew her. That she had built an entire adult identity since that night, and he was relating to a ghost. She was right. She was also, completely and totally, lying to herself. She started noticing things. Small things. The way Kofi spoke about their future as if it were a business plan, a logical series of milestones to be reached and checked off. The way he asked how her day was but had already begun looking at his phone before she finished answering. The way she could go through an entire dinner with him and feel, afterward, as though she had been alone. She had called this steadiness. She had called this maturity. But in the deep, quiet place where she kept the things she refused to say out loud, she was beginning to call it something else. She was beginning to call it disappearing. 6 weeks before the wedding, she called Daniel. Not to break off her engagement. Not with any agenda she could have named. She called him because she had been sitting in her apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the city humming outside her window, and she had felt so profoundly, inexplicably alone that the silence had become physical, something she could press against. He answered on the second ring. He asked how she was. She said, "I don't know." They met the next morning. A park, this time open air, no table between them, the city going about its business around the edges of where they stood. She had not slept well. She suspected he could tell. She said, without preamble, "You came back after all this time. And I need you to explain something to me. What exactly did you come back for? Because it cannot just be gratitude. Gratitude doesn't look like this." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You saw me when no one else did. And something cracked." She said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw by something she had been carrying for too long, "And no one saw me after that." The words hit the air between them and hung there. It was the most honest thing she had said in years. It was the thing she hadn't been able to say to Kofi, hadn't been able to say to her mother, hadn't been able to say in therapy because even in therapy she had been diplomatic and measured and careful. But here, standing in a park at 7 in the morning, she had just said it. And he heard it. Not the way people hear things politely. Not with a nod and a considered response already forming before you've finished speaking. He heard it the way she had once heard him, all the way down, into the place where things actually land. He said, "I know. And I am sorry. I'm sorry it took me this long." She turned away from him. She looked at the city. She felt tears forming and was furious at them. She said, "You don't know me anymore. You know who I was." He said, "Then let me know who you are now." She said, "I'm a woman 6 weeks from her wedding." He said, I know that too. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he said, very quietly, I didn't come back to repay you. I want you to understand that. This isn't about what you gave me that night. I came back because I never stopped choosing you. Even when I didn't know where you were, or who you'd become, or whether any of this was possible, in some part of me that I couldn't negotiate with, I kept choosing you. She didn't respond. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. She breathed. Then she said, I have to go. He nodded. He didn't reach for her. He didn't beg her to stay. He didn't try to be the hero of this moment in any of the ways that would have made it easier to walk away from him. He just let her go. And that, of all the things he had done or said, that particular act of restraint was the one that broke her the most completely. Because the man who loved her had just chosen her freedom over his own desire. And the man she was engaged to had never once had to make that choice, because she had never once felt free enough to need it. She walked to her car. She sat inside it. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. For the first time in years, real years, counted years, she let herself cry without managing it. 3 days later, Amara Osei walked down a street she had not walked down in a very long time. Not the street from that rainy night, she didn't know if she could find it anymore, the city had changed too much. But a street with the same texture. The same flickering lights. The same weight in the air of lives being lived very close to the edge. She wasn't sure why she had come. She told herself she was walking. She told herself she needed air. She told herself she was thinking about the wedding, the caterer, the seating arrangements, the fact that Kofi had sent her 3 emails that week with subject lines like venue confirmation, action required, and she had not opened a single one. And then she saw a young woman sitting on the curb outside a closed shop. She was perhaps 19, 20. Her shoulders were hunched against the wind. She had a plastic bag that seemed to contain everything she currently owned. She was not crying, and she was not asking for anything. She was simply sitting with the specific, exhausted dignity of someone who has run out of options for the night. Amara stopped. She stood there on the pavement and she felt the whole arc of it, 15 years, a full half-rotation of her adult life, curling back around like a wave returning to shore. She did not have extra money on her. She had her phone, her keys, a transit card, and about 300 naira in her jacket pocket, enough for nothing that would change anything. She hesitated. She thought, I am not the person I used to be. And then the other voice, the stubborn one, the unkillable one, he said, you were never not that person. You just spent some years pretending otherwise. She walked over. She sat down on the curb beside the girl, not above her, not leaning down toward her from a standing position, but beside her. She asked her name. The girl, surprised enough to answer, said it was Grace. They talked for 20 minutes. By the end of those 20 minutes, Amara had called a women's shelter she knew about from years ago, confirmed there was space, and arranged for Grace to get there safely. It cost her the 300 naira and 1 phone call and 20 minutes of sitting on a curb in the wind. It also cost her something she couldn't quantify, some last vestige of the wall. She walked home slowly. The city was beginning to change colors as evening came on, the sky going from orange to purple above the rooftops, and she felt something she had been trying to locate for a very long time. She felt like herself. Not the 23-year-old version. Not the naive, pre-wounded version. She was not going backward. She was 31 years old with full knowledge of every scar she carried and every way the world had tried to teach her that openness was dangerous. She chose it anyway. Not because she had forgotten the cost. But because she decided, walking home through the purple evening, that the cost of closing had turned out to be higher. She called Daniel that night. Not with a speech prepared. Not with a plan. Just her voice and the truth. She said, I don't need someone to save me. I want you to know that before I say anything else. I am not calling because I'm falling apart. I'm calling because I've spent 15 years being very careful about who gets to see me, and I'm tired of that. I'm tired of disappearing inside my own life. Silence on the line. Then, okay. Just that. Okay. Not I knew it, not I told you, not anything that would have turned this moment into a performance. Just the willingness to receive what she was saying without making it about himself. She said, I need time. I have things I need to do that are not easy and not nothing. But after that. She stopped. He waited. She said, I want to be seen again. The conversation with Kofi was the hardest thing she had done in years. She did not dress it up. She did not make him a villain, because he wasn't one. He was a good man who had fallen in love with a woman who had never quite been available for what he was offering, and that was not his failure alone. She told him the truth as clearly and kindly as she could, and she sat with the discomfort of what that truth did to him, because she owed him that much. She did not go directly from that conversation to Daniel's door. She took time. Real time, not performative time, not the kind you take so that you can say you are responsible. She sat with herself. She reconnected with the version of herself she had tried to mothball. She helped Grace, from the shelter, find a training program. She called her mother back. She went for long walks in the early morning before the city got loud. And one afternoon, several months after the park, after the curb, after everything, she showed up at a place Daniel had told her she could find him on Sunday mornings. He was standing outside a community kitchen he had been quietly funding for 2 years, another thing she had not known about him, another glimpse of the person he had grown into. He saw her. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, like someone keeping very still in order not to frighten away something precious. She walked toward him. She said, You were right. You came back when you could. I know that. He said, and you came back when you were ready. I know that too. No grand speech. No music. No one was watching, not really. Just two people who had taken 15 years and immeasurable detours to arrive at the same sentence, I choose this. Now. With full knowledge of the cost. I choose this. He didn't produce a ring in that moment. That came later, quietly, without spectacle, on an ordinary evening when the question felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something they had both already decided. And when he asked, and she felt the familiar flutter of the old instinct, the one that wanted to hesitate, to protect, to hedge, she let it flutter. She acknowledged it. And then she said yes. Slowly. Intentionally. Eyes open. Yes. Here is what I want to leave with you tonight. Kindness is not a weakness. I know the world will try to teach you otherwise, and it will be persuasive, because the lessons come gift-wrapped in real pain and real disappointment and real people who took what you gave and treated it carelessly. Those experiences are not imaginary. They are not excuses. They are facts. But closing is also a cost. And I think we don't talk about that cost honestly enough. We call it wisdom. We call it maturity. We call it learning to protect ourselves. And sometimes it is those things. But sometimes, and you will know the difference, even if you try not to, sometimes it is just fear wearing a sensible outfit. Amara spent years building a wall that looked, from the outside, like having herself together. And it served her. It kept certain things out. But it also kept certain things in, including the version of herself she liked best, the one who could sit on a curb beside a stranger without calculating whether it was worth it. She got that version back. Not because a man returned to her. Not because love arrived and fixed things. She got it back because one evening in a purple sky she chose it, for herself, before anyone else entered the frame. And the love that followed? That was not the reward for being good. Love is not a reward. Love is not something you earn by being generous enough or patient enough or perfect enough in the right sequence. Love is a choice you make again and again, with full knowledge of the risk, with your eyes open and your hands steady. Again. And again. And again. If this story reached something in you, if there's a version of yourself you've been storing away because the world made it feel unsafe to carry, I want you to think about what it would cost you to take one small step back toward that person. Not all the way. Just one step. Because the people who need to see you really see you are out there. and they can't find you behind a wall, no matter how beautifully you built it. If this story meant something to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who has forgotten what it feels like to be seen. Share it with someone who gave too much and got burned and decided never again. Tell them, there's a difference between protecting yourself and disappearing yourself. And subscribe, because every week, we bring you stories like this one. Not fairy tales. Not perfect endings. But real, human, complicated stories that remind you what you're made of and what you're still capable of choosing. We'll see you in the next one.